burning heart of the Wild West, a native chief's daughter carries a 1,000-year treasure, hunted by a ruthless outlaw who killed her father. On the edge of death, she's saved by a lone cowboy with nothing left to lose. But as bullets fly and betrayal stalks every shadow, their fight for survival will lead to a discovery neither of them could imagine, and a choice that will change their lives forever. The sun was dying over Monument Valley, bleeding its last light across a desert that seemed to stretch into forever. Great monoliths of red stone rose like the bones of an ancient giant, their jagged silhouettes cutting into the burning sky. The wind carried the taste of dust and the scent of sage, whispering through the empty canyons as if it carried secrets too old for human ears. Somewhere far off, a lone hawk screamed its cry sharp enough to make the air tremble. Aiyana Redfern leaned low over her horse's neck, urging the animal to run faster. The mare's sides were slick with sweat, each stride jarring Aiyana's body, but she dared not slow. Behind her, somewhere in the echoing labyrinth of the valley, came the sound she feared most, the rhythmic pounding of many hooves. She didn't need to look back to know they were gaining on her. She could feel them in her bones, their hunger, their certainty, their hatred. She clutched the leather satchel against her chest with a grip so tight her knuckles whitened. It was small enough to be hidden under her arm, but the weight of it felt as heavy as the desert sky pressing down. Inside was the Eagle Stone, the heart of her people, a relic born from the earth long before the first rifle fired in this land. Her father, Chief Redfern, had been the last to hold it until this morning. The attack had come at dawn as the camp stirred to life. She could still hear the gunfire tearing through the quiet, see the warriors fall one by one, hear the guttural war cries mingling with the shouts of the invaders. In the chaos, her father had pressed the satchel into her arms. His face painted with ash and ochre had been calm, even as blood ran down his temple. "Go," he'd said in Comanche, his voice unshaken. "Protect it. Protect our future." She had wanted to stay to fight, but he shoved her toward her mare. Moments later, she had heard his final cry, the kind that stops a heart cold. Now, hours later, she was still running. Her pursuers were led by Malcolm Vane, a name spoken in her tribe with a mix of fear and fury. Once, a Confederate officer, Vane had traded the uniform for outlaw leather, but kept the cruelty and discipline of a soldier. His scarred face was as hard as the canyon walls, and his eyes were the color of gunmetal. He had come for the Eagle Stone, claiming it was payment for the blood of his men lost years ago in battles with her people. But Aiyana knew the truth. Vane was a scavenger of legends, a man who believed that controlling sacred treasures meant controlling the land and all who lived on it. Her mare stumbled on a patch of loose shale, nearly sending them both into the jagged rocks below. She tightened her knees, steadied the animal, and urged her forward. The valley's vastness suddenly felt like a trap every shadow could hide, an enemy every echo could be the sound of gunfire. The sun was sinking too fast, its light bleeding away until the world turned copper, then rust, then black. The dry creek bed ahead looked like salvation, a narrow cut in the earth where she might lose their line of sight. She spurred the mare toward it, heart hammering. The animal leapt down into the gully hooves, striking stone, skidding on the loose gravel. The impact jarred Aiyana's injured shoulder from an earlier close call, sending a flash of pain down her arm. Then it happened. The mare's front hoof wedged between two jagged rocks. The horse screamed, buckled, and threw her rider forward. The ground rose up and struck her like a hammer. For a moment, there was only light white and sharp, then it shattered into a swirl of shadow. She landed hard on her side, the satchel trapped beneath her. The pain was immediate, blooming in her ribs and shoulder. Somewhere above, the mare struggled free and bolted into the darkness, leaving Aiyana alone. She could hear them now. The hoofbeats were closer. the men shouting to each other, their voices bouncing off the stone walls of the valley. There was no time to run. She dragged herself toward a rock outcropping, each movement a knife in her side. The satchel was still in her grasp. She pressed it against her chest, as if by holding it tightly enough she could will herself invisible. The first star appeared overhead, a lonely glimmer in the purple sky. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She thought of her father's eyes in those final moments, not afraid, not angry, just certain. She thought of the long winter nights by the fire, when he told her the story of the eagle stone, how it had fallen from the sky in a storm of fire, how it had been guarded by every chief since the first sunrise, how it was said to hold the power of the earth itself. And she thought of the vow she had made as a child, kneeling before the elders, swearing to protect her people no matter the cost. Aiyana's lips moved, whispering the old words in her language. Father, guide me. Mother, give me strength. Spirits, hide me in your shadow. The hoofbeats slowed. She could hear the creak of saddles, the snort of horses, the low rasp of Malcolm Vane's voice giving orders. The scrape of boots on stone told her they were searching their torches, casting flickering light across the canyon walls. Her vision was fading now. The edges of the world grew soft, the sounds distant. She held the satchel tighter as if it were a lifeline. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the stone's cold weight steady and unyielding. Then the darkness claimed her. Somewhere beyond the ringing in her ears, a new sound entered the night, a single set of hoofbeats, slow and measured, coming from the opposite direction. Colt McAlister had learned a long time ago that silence could be as heavy as a loaded gun. Out here on the edge of Dead Horse Point, silence was his only constant companion. The wind came up from the Colorado River far below, carrying the cool scent of water and the faint rustle of cottonwoods that clung stubbornly to the banks. The land was vast, wild, and empty, just the way he liked it. In this isolation there were no questions about his past, no eyes watching for weakness, no faces to remind him of the lives he couldn't save. His cabin was nothing more than pine boards weathered to silver by years of wind and dust. A porch that creaked under his boots, a single window looking west, a lean-to where his horse dozed in the shade. Each day unfolded like the one before, splitting logs, mending fences, setting snares in the gullies where rabbits ran, and fishing the river when the mood took him. It had been almost 3 years since Colt had given up the Pinkerton badge. The memory of that final case was a wound that refused to heal, an ambush gone wrong. A family caught in the crossfire, the weight of their deaths pressing down on him like the desert sun. He had left without a word, heading west until there was nowhere else to go. Dead Horse Point had been his final stop, a place where the world seemed to end in red cliffs and empty sky. That morning, as he rode out to check the traps he'd set the day before, Colt noticed the vultures, first 3 of them circling low over the desert a mile to the east. Vultures meant death, but sometimes death was worth investigating. He turned the gelding's head toward them, the horse's hooves kicking up little puffs of dust as they cut across the plateau. What he found was not a coyote or a lost calf, but a woman. She lay half hidden among the rocks, her dark hair spilling like ink across the pale sand. Her shoulder was twisted in a way that told him it had been dislocated and roughly set back in place. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. The leather satchel clutched against her chest was gripped so tightly he thought he'd have to pry it from her fingers. Colt slid from the saddle and crouched beside her. He studied her face, high cheekbones, sun-browned skin, lips pressed together even in unconsciousness, as if she were bracing against some unseen force. The clothes she wore were torn from hard travel, her boots scuffed and dusty. Whoever she was, she hadn't been lying here long. He hesitated for only a moment before lifting her into the saddle. She was light, but the way she sagged against him told him she had nothing left to give. The gelding carried them both steadily back to the cabin. Inside, Colt set her on his bed and went to work. Years on the trail had taught him how to handle wounds. He cleaned the scrapes on her hands, bound the gash on her temple, and worked her shoulder into a more natural position. She didn't stir until the scent of coffee drifted into the air hours later. Her eyes opened slowly, sharp and wary. She scanned the room, her gaze locking on the satchel which he had left within reach. "You're safe," he said simply, setting down the mug on the small table by her side. "Name's Colt." She said nothing for a moment, her breathing still uneven. Then, in a voice rough from thirst, "Aiyana." He nodded toward the mug. "Drink. You'll feel human again." Aiyana sipped the coffee cautiously, never taking her eyes off him. He saw the guarded way she sat her back straight, despite the pain, her hand resting lightly on the satchel, as if it were part of her. He didn't ask about it. Not yet. "You're a long way from anywhere," Colt said finally. She gave a faint, humorless smile. That's the point. For the rest of the day, he let her rest. When he brought her food that night, a simple stew of venison and beans, she ate in silence, but her eyes softened a little. Later, by the fire, he worked a piece of cedar into the shape of a horse, the blade of his knife whispering against the grain. She watched him from across the room, her expression unreadable. "You carve for a living?" she asked. "No, for my hands. Keeps them busy." That drew the smallest flicker of a smile from her. The next morning, Colt saddled his horse and asked if she wanted to ride out with him to check his snares. She hesitated, then agreed. The air was cool, the scent of sage sharp in their nostrils as they rode across the plateau. He showed her, where the rabbits favored the brush, how to set the loops just right, how to hide the trap so it was invisible even to sharp eyes. She moved with quiet grace, her hands sure and quick. "You've done this before," he said. In another life, she replied, and nothing more. By the third day, Aiyana was strong enough to move about the cabin on her own. Colt returned from the river to find her standing on the porch, looking out over the canyon as the sun slid toward the horizon. The light painted her face in shades of gold and fire. She didn't turn when he joined her. "This place," she said softly, "feels like it's watching, like it remembers." Colt glanced at her, sensing the weight behind the words. "Places do remember," he said. "So do people." Her eyes met his then, and for a heartbeat he thought she might tell him the story that lived in her silence. But she only nodded and went back inside. He didn't push. He'd learned the hard way that some truths had to be carried until the bearer was ready to share them. And yet, as the days passed, he began to realize something he hadn't expected. The cabin no longer felt quite so empty. Her presence was a quiet thing, like the shadow of a hawk gliding over the land, easy to miss, but once noticed impossible to forget. Colt told himself she would leave soon. People always did, but there was a part of him, a small, stubborn part, that hoped she wouldn't. The cold light of dawn revealed what the night had hidden. Colt McAlister stepped onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, and froze. Frost clung to the ground in pale sheets, and there pressed into the fragile crust were the clear marks of boot prints. They circled the cabin, coming close to the windows, pausing by the barn, and then disappearing into the sagebrush. The tracks were fresh, so fresh that the edges still held their sharp shape. Someone had been here while the cabin slept. More than one someone. He crouched, studying them with a hunter's eye. The depth of the prints told him the men were heavy, carrying rifles or gear. Some of the impressions were worn smooth on the heels, a sign of seasoned riders who had walked in their boots for years. He straightened slowly, his jaw tightening. Malcolm Vane had found them. Inside, Aiyana was at the stove pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. She glanced up at him the moment he stepped in, reading his face before he could speak. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady but low. "They've been here," Colt replied, setting his mug aside. circling, watching. She didn't ask who. She already knew. Her hand drifted to the leather satchel resting on the table. Her fingers curled over it almost possessively. "Vane," she said, not as a question, but as a fact. Colt nodded. "He's close. Closer than I'd like." Aiyana's eyes shifted to the window, scanning the endless stretch of desert beyond, as if she might see him riding toward them already. "He won't stop," she said finally. "Not until he has this." She tapped the satchel gently, and in that moment the tension in her shoulders seemed to harden into resolve. Colt leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You've been running since I found you. Maybe it's time I hear the whole story." For a moment, silence filled the cabin except for the faint hiss of the stove. Then she began to speak. She told him about her father's final stand about the Eagle Stone, about the treasure hidden deep in Antelope Canyon. She spoke of its spiritual weight, its history woven into the heartbeat of her tribe. Her voice was steady, but Colt could hear the undercurrent of grief like a river running beneath ice. "It's not just gold or silver," she said. "It's who we are. It's the promise my father died to protect. If Vane takes it, he destroys more than my people's past, he steals our future." Colt studied her for a long moment before answering. "Then we don't let him take it." The first rifle shot came before the words had fully settled in the air. It splintered the doorframe, the sound echoing across the plateau. Colt moved without thinking, grabbing his Winchester and shoving Aiyana toward the floor. The sharp smell of gunpowder drifted in almost immediately, carried by the wind through the shattered wood. Through the window, he saw them. 6 riders spread in a loose arc, their coats flapping in the early wind faces hidden behind scarves. In the middle sat Malcolm Vane himself, upright, and composed his scar, catching the light. Even from this distance, his eyes had that cold gleam, a man who'd come to finish what he'd started. His voice rang out clear and taunting. McAlister hand over the girl and the bag. "Do that, and maybe I let you keep breathing." Colt's answer was the sharp crack of his rifle. One of Vane's men jerked backward in the saddle and hit the ground. The fight exploded in an instant. Bullets slammed into the cabin's walls, tearing through the thin wood-rattling dishes from the shelves. Colt ducked behind the heavy table, firing through a narrow slit between the boards. Aiyana, crouched near the far wall, pulled her bow from its leather case. Her movements were smooth and practiced, her eyes calm. She knocked an arrow, drew, and let it fly. One of the riders cried out, clutching his side. She loosed another, striking a man's arm and sending his revolver spinning into the dust. The sound was deafening, gunfire, cracking horses, screaming wood, splintering under the hail of bullets. Colt moved from cover to cover, never wasting a shot. He'd fought enough men to know that precision beat speed. Each time he squeezed the trigger, another rider fell back or scrambled for shelter. But for every man down, another pushed forward, using the barn and the scattered rocks for cover. The fight had been going on long enough for Colt to notice something troubling. They were inching closer. Vane was sending 2 of his men wide, looping around the back of the cabin. Colt swore under his breath. If they got behind him, the fight would end quick. And then the sound changed. A deep, deliberate rifle shot cracked from somewhere above, followed by the sharp cry of a man hit. Another shot followed this one, dropping a rider clean out of his saddle. Over the din came a voice Colt recognized. "Sheriff's here." From the ridge, Sheriff Wyatt Briggs rode down with 3 deputies at his side, their guns already blazing. The sheriff was a tall, broad man with the kind of presence that made you believe in law and order, even in a place as wild as this. His coat flew open as he fired, revealing the gleam of his badge. The deputies flanked him, pressing Vane's men between the cabin and their advancing line. The outlaws broke. Vane gave one last glance toward the cabin, long enough for Colt to see the promise in his eyes. This wasn't over. Then he wheeled his horse and rode hard for the horizon, his men scattering in his wake. Silence fell in jagged pieces broken only by the fading thunder of hooves. The air was thick with the smell of spent powder and trampled sage. Colt stepped onto the porch, lowering his rifle as the sheriff dismounted. Briggs gave the cabin a quick once-over, his eyes lingering on the bullet-pocked walls. "Heard Vane was making noise out here," he said. "Figured if I followed the trail, I'd find trouble. Looks like I was right." Colt gave a small nod. "You were." The sheriff's gaze shifted to Aiyana, who had stepped into the doorway, bow still in hand. "You're lucky he showed up when he did," Briggs said. "I don't believe in luck," Aiyana replied, her voice steady. "Only in the choices we make." Briggs studied her for a moment, then looked back toward the desert. "Vane doesn't take defeat kindly. He'll come again." Inside the cabin, Aiyana set the bow aside and sat at the table, her hand, once more, resting on the satchel. Colt poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of her. The fight was over, but both of them knew it was only the first round. Vane would return, and when he did, they would be ready. They made camp a few miles from the canyon in a sheltered hollow where the fire's light couldn't be seen from afar. Over a simple meal, they spoke little. The night was alive with the sounds of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Colt sat across from Aiyana, the firelight dancing in her eyes, and for the first time since he had found her, he allowed himself to think of a future beyond tomorrow's fight. In that quiet, he understood something he had been trying not to admit. The journey had changed him. He had set out to help her because it was the right thing to do, but somewhere along the trail it had become more than that. The land, the stories, the unshakable way she carried herself, it had begun to anchor him to something he didn't know he'd been searching for. And though Vane was still out there somewhere beyond the ridges, Colt felt ready for whatever came next. Because now the fight wasn't just hers. It was his, too. The morning after the attack, the air carried a rare stillness, the kind that felt like the world was holding its breath. Aiyana stood outside the cabin with the satchel pressed to her side, the rising sun spilling gold over the plateau. Colt watched her from the doorway, knowing before she spoke that she had made a decision. When she turned to him, there was a quiet fire in her eyes. "It's time," she said. "We can't wait for Vane to come again. We take the Eagle Stone home." Sheriff Briggs, who had stayed the night in the barn with his deputies, joined them. His face was hard from years of chasing men across deserts and mountains, but something in Aiyana's words softened him. "You know he'll follow you," he said. "He's not the type to let go of a prize." Aiyana nodded, then let him follow. "But we'll be ahead of him, and he'll find nothing but shadows." They set out at first light, heading south toward Antelope Canyon. The trail wound across open stretches of wind-swept rock, through narrow ravines, where the echoes of their horses' hooves seemed to belong to another time. The land was ancient, worn into strange shapes by centuries of wind and water, and each turn felt like stepping deeper into a world that belonged more to the earth than to men. Colt rode beside Aiyana, his eyes scanning the ridges for movement. The memory of the battle at the cabin was still sharp in his mind, and he knew Vane could be tracking them even now. But the farther they rode, the more he sensed something shifting, not just in the air, but in her. She was no longer the hunted girl he had found half dead in the desert. There was a steadiness in her now, a quiet authority that seemed to grow stronger the closer they came to their destination. By midday, they reached the mouth of the canyon. From the outside, it appeared as little more than a narrow slit in the earth, the sandstone walls glowing in shades of deep red and burnt orange. But as they dismounted and stepped inside, the world changed. Sunlight filtered down in thin golden shafts, illuminating swirling patterns in the rock that looked almost alive. The air was cool and still, and every sound seemed magnified: their footsteps on the sand, the faint rustle of Aiyana's dress, the steady creak of Colt's leather gear. They moved deeper, following the twists of the canyon until the sound of falling water reached them. Around a final bend, they came upon a narrow waterfall, spilling into a shallow pool, the water clear as glass. Behind the curtain of water was a dark crevice, just wide enough for a person to slip through. Aiyana stepped forward, removing her boots to wade into the pool. The water came up to her knees, cold enough to bite at her skin, but she moved with certainty. Colt followed, and when they passed behind the falls, the light dimmed. The crevice opened into a hidden chamber, and there, in the cool shadow of the canyon, lay the treasure. It was not the gleaming piles of gold and silver one might imagine from the tales of outlaws. Instead, it was something older, something that spoke of history rather than greed. Chests bound in rawhide overflowed with turquoise and silver jewelry, feathered headdresses, carved stone figures and weapons inlaid with patterns that told stories, in lines and shapes. And in the center, resting upon a carved stone pedestal, sat the eagle stone. Its surface was smooth and dark, but it caught the light in a way that seemed to draw it inward rather than reflect it. Aiyana approached it slowly, her hand hovering above it before she finally touched it. Her eyes closed, and for a moment she seemed somewhere far away. When she opened them again, she spoke in a voice that carried through the chamber. "This is the heart of my people. My father gave his life so it could return here, and now it will never leave again." Colt stood back, watching her, feeling the gravity of the moment settle over him. He had seen riches before, fortunes in stolen gold, blood money hidden in riverbanks, but nothing had ever felt like this. This was not about wealth. This was about roots, about a bond between a people and their land that no outlaw could ever truly understand. Briggs stepped forward, resting his hand lightly on the butt of his revolver. "Vane won't stop just because this place is sacred. If he finds it, he'll take it all." Aiyana looked at him with a calm certainty. "He won't find it. The canyon hides its own secrets, and my people have kept this safe for 1,000 years. But now we have more than the land on our side." She glanced at Colt. "We have each other." They stayed in the chamber for a time, Aiyana showing them the artifacts, explaining their meaning. The dance masks used in winter ceremonies, the obsidian blades passed from warrior to warrior, the carved figures that told of battles fought before the white man came. Her voice carried pride and reverence, and Colt found himself listening not just to her words, but to the way they seemed to belong to the air around them, as though the canyon itself was listening. As the afternoon light began to fade, they stepped back out through the waterfall. The sun was lowering, casting the canyon walls in deep crimson shadows. Colt helped Aiyana back onto her horse, and as they rode out, he caught her glancing back toward the hidden entrance, her hand brushing the satchel one last time. It no longer held the eagle stone. It had been returned to its rightful place, but the gesture was more than habit. It was a farewell. The ride back to the tribal lands began under a sky the color of hammered silver clouds drifting low over the mesa tops. The trail wound between ridges and across open flats where the wind moved in long, cold breaths, carrying with it the scent of rain that would never come. Aiyana rode at the front, her posture proud but not rigid, as though the land itself had given her its quiet strength. Colt followed close behind, his eyes always scanning the horizon, the habit of a man who knew danger could rise from any shadow. Sheriff Briggs rode with them for part of the way, keeping his promise to see them through the most vulnerable stretch. By the time they crossed the last ridge, the valley opened like a book written in color-wide green pastures dotted with wildflowers, a ribbon of river winding toward a cluster of lodges. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the sound of drums floated faintly on the wind. Word of their arrival must have traveled ahead, because figures began to gather at the edge of the settlement, children darting forward to get a first glimpse. When they entered the camp, Aiyana was surrounded. Elders stepped forward with tears in their eyes, pressing their foreheads to hers, speaking in the old tongue words of welcome and relief. Warriors clasped her arms in the manner of equals, honoring her return. The air was thick with emotion, grief for what had been lost, joy for what had been saved. Colt dismounted quietly, unsure of his place in the sea of embraces and voices. He was an outsider here, and yet no one turned him away. It was the eldest of the council, a woman with hair as white as winter snow, who finally approached him. Her gaze was sharp and assessing, but her smile was warm. "You brought her home," she said simply, "and you did not take for yourself what was not yours. That speaks louder than any words." She laid a hand on his arm in thanks, and in that small gesture, Colt felt more acceptance than he had in years. The next days moved in a rhythm unlike anything Colt had known. There were ceremonies to honor the dead feasts, to celebrate the return of the Eagle Stone, and nights when the fire burned until the first light of dawn. He learned the dances not as a performer, but as an observer who came to understand their meaning, each step a memory, each drumbeat a promise. Children followed him around the camp, fascinated by his horse and the way his knife could turn a block of cedar into a small, perfect figure. Warriors asked him about his rifle, about the fights he had seen, and though he did not boast, he answered with honesty. Vane's name came up only once, when Sheriff Briggs returned briefly to bring news. The gang had been driven far into the desert, scattered and broken, though Briggs suspected Vane himself had slipped away. "A man like that doesn't vanish easy," the sheriff warned. "But for now you've bought yourselves peace." Colt knew the man was right, but he also knew this land had ways of hiding what it wanted to keep. One evening, as the last of the sun's light faded behind the cliffs, the tribe gathered in the central clearing. The fire was built high, and its light reached every face in the circle. Aiyana stood before the elders, dressed in a ceremonial gown of soft buckskin embroidered with intricate beadwork, her hair braided with eagle feathers. The headdress of her father rested in her hands. She spoke to her people not as the chief's daughter, but as one who had carried their legacy into the teeth of danger and returned with it intact. Her words were steady, carrying over the crackle of the fire and into the night beyond. She spoke of loss, but also of resilience, of the importance of guarding not just what could be held in the hand, but what lived in the spirit. When she finished, she turned to Colt. For a moment the crowd seemed to fall away, the noise fading to a hush. "You came to me as a stranger," she said, her voice strong yet warm, "a man with no ties and no reason to stand between me and death. Yet you did, not once, but again and again. You asked for nothing in return, but you gave me back my home, my people, my future. I have no greater gift to offer than this stay, not as a guest, but as my husband." Colt felt the weight of every eye in the clearing, but all he could see was her face lit by fire and shadow. He thought of the years he had spent drifting, of the silence he had called home, of the feeling that nothing he did could matter. That feeling was gone now, burned away by something stronger. Yes, he said the word, low but certain. "I'll stay." The cheer that rose from the crowd was like a wave breaking against the cliffs. Elders stepped forward to bless the union, the firelight dancing in their eyes. The ceremony that followed was both simple and timeless. The binding of hands with a strip of woven cloth, the shared drink from a carved wooden cup, the placing of 2 eagle feathers side by side in the fire to carry their vows into the sky. When it was done, music and laughter filled the night. Colt found himself drawn into the dance, awkward at first, but guided by hands that welcomed him. Aiyana's smile was bright and unguarded, and when she laughed it felt like something in him that had been locked away finally gave way. Later, when the fire had burned low and the camp had grown quiet, Colt and Aiyana rode out together to the ridge above the valley. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, the land bathed in silver light. Below them, the lodges and fires of the camp glowed softly, a small but steady flame against the vast dark. Colt looked out over it all and felt for the first time in years that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The wind moved gently through the sage, carrying the scent of home. He glanced at Aiyana, and she met his gaze with a look that needed no words. The West was still wild, still dangerous, but now it was also theirs. And whatever lay beyond the horizon, whether peace or storm, they would face it together. When the dust finally settled over the wild and unforgiving lands of the American West, the story of Aiyana Redfern and Colt McAlister remained not just a tale of survival, but of transformation, honor, and the unbreakable link between people and the land they call home. Aiyana's journey began in blood and fire. As the daughter of Chief Redfern, she was entrusted with the Eagle Stone, a sacred artifact carrying the history and spirit of her people. The attack on her village by Malcolm Vane's ruthless gang tore her from the safety of her community and forced her into a desperate flight across the desert. That single moment when her father placed the satchel in her hands and told her to run was the dividing line between the life she knew and the life she would have to fight for. Her escape through Monument Valley was a battle against exhaustion, pain, and the relentless pursuit of men who valued the treasure for greed, not for heritage. It was in this crucible that fate brought her to Colt McAlister, a man living on the edge of the world in self-imposed exile. Colt was no stranger to loss or violence. His years as a Pinkerton detective had left him hollow, and Dead Horse Point was the place he had chosen to vanish into. Yet, when he found Aiyana lying wounded in the desert, he made a choice that would change them both. He brought her into his home, cared for her injuries, and asked for nothing in return. What began as an act of compassion quickly grew into a bond forged in trust and mutual respect. Colt, who had avoided human ties for years, found himself drawn into her mission. Aiyana, who had trusted no one since her father's death, came to rely on his steadiness. That trust was tested when Vane's men found them surrounding Colt's cabin in a violent siege. The pair fought side by side, her arrows flying as true as his bullets. It was only with the timely arrival of Sheriff Wyatt Briggs and his deputies that the attackers were driven off. But everyone knew Vane would not give up so easily. Rather than wait for another assault, Aiyana decided to finish the journey her father had begun. With Colt and the sheriff as allies, she returned to Antelope Canyon, leading them through twisting passages of red sandstone and into the hidden chamber where the Eagle Stone and the tribal treasures lay. The chamber was a sanctuary filled not with mere riches, but with the physical embodiment of a people's identity. It was here that Colt began to understand what he was fighting for, and it was here that Aiyana's mission came full circle. She had protected the treasure not for its value, but for the generations who would inherit its meaning. Returning to her tribe was not the end, but a beginning. The homecoming was a celebration of survival and resilience. Elders wept to see Aiyana alive, warriors honored her courage, and the people gave thanks that their sacred treasure was safe. Colt, once an outsider, was welcomed with quiet respect, not because he had simply fought beside Aiyana, but because he had resisted the temptation to claim any part of what was not his. In the days that followed, Colt learned that life in the tribal lands was not defined by isolation or fear, but by community-shared purpose and the honoring of both past and future. He saw children playing under the same sky where he had once ridden alone, saw the elders teach stories that bound the people together, and felt the rhythm of a life that was both grounded and free. When Aiyana stood before her people and asked him to remain not as a guest, but as her husband, it was not only a declaration of love, but an invitation to belong. For a man who had carried nothing but ghosts for years, it was the one offer he could not refuse. Their union was celebrated in a ceremony that bound tradition with the promise of a shared future. The eagle stone remained where it belonged, protected not only by the land, but by the people who understood its true worth. Vane's shadow might still linger somewhere beyond the horizon, but for the moment peace held. Colt had found what he didn't know he was looking for: a place, a purpose, and a partner who matched him in spirit and strength. The lesson in their story is one that transcends time and geography. It speaks to the idea that what defines us is not what we possess, but what we choose to protect. Aiyana could have fled far from her people, keeping herself safe, while leaving the eagle stone behind, but she understood that heritage is a living thing. It survives only if it is defended. Colt could have turned away when he found her staying in the solitude that shielded him from pain, but he chose to step forward and stand beside her. In doing so, he found the healing that isolation had denied him. In our modern world, we may not be chased across deserts by outlaws on horseback, but we face our own versions of vain forces that threaten to take from us the things we value most, whether they are relationships, integrity, or the principles we stand for. The story of Aiyana and Colt reminds us that courage often means standing our ground, even when it is easier to walk away, and that sometimes the act of protecting something greater than ourselves is the very thing that gives our own lives meaning. Applying this lesson today means asking ourselves hard questions. What is worth protecting in my life? What am I willing to risk to defend it? It could be the time you guard for your family despite the demands of work. It could be your commitment to honesty when shortcuts tempt you. It could be your cultural roots, your creative passions, or your community's well-being. Like the eagle stone, these are treasures that cannot be measured in dollars, but whose loss would leave us poorer in ways that truly matter. It also means recognizing that we do not have to face these battles alone. The alliance between Aiyana Colt and the sheriff is a reminder that trust once given and honored can create bonds strong enough to withstand almost anything. In an age where individualism is often prized above all, their story shows the quiet power of standing together. And perhaps the deepest lesson is that it is never too late to find where you belong. Colt's years of wandering had convinced him that home was a thing he had lost forever, yet it was waiting for him all along, hidden in a cause worth fighting for, and a partnership worth committing to. No matter how far we think we've drifted, there is always a path back if we have the courage to take it. If this story has stayed with you, if it has made you feel the grit of the desert wind, the tension of the fight, and the quiet satisfaction of finding a place where you are meant to be, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, support the work that brings these stories to life, and help ensure that more tales of courage, honor, and the untamed spirit of the West find their way to you. Your support gives us the fire to keep riding into the next adventure, and we can't wait to share it with you.